Good evening. This is the start of the second week of my new time slot, and I solemnly promise that I shall never again swear in the slightest manner on this program. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm not going to tell you. And in this whimsically philosophical mood, I would like to give our new Premier, impudent though it may be, a small piece of advice. Since he became Premier, he has charmed everyone out of their socks, and the promises have been dripping from his lips. Some of the promises are easy ones, like cheaper beer for the working class and that kind of thing, but others of the promises are already worrying what must be his free enterprise, hidebound free enterprise backers. Like he's got about 50 million extra up for BCGEU, and he's going to be knocked for 20 or 30 million right now for the nurses and the hospital workers. He has properly increased some of the handicapped welfare allowances. He's going to knock off the 7% tax. He's talking about special taxes that you can allocate to your parochial or private school, and many other provinces. And he's already given out, he tells me, the Louisiana Pacific contract, which was one thing I was sure that Bill Vander Zalm, the great free enterpriser, would hold back on a little bit, because the concessions demanded, asked for by Louisiana Pacific, would make anybody in the Fraser Institute turn over in their nightshirts. So, Premier Vander Zalm, my suggestion is very simple. Don't equivocate any longer. Call a general election at the earliest possible date, because then we will see what you must do in the way of legislation to implement it. You probably will anyway, Bill, because you're riding this crest of your charisma and your well-deserved popularity for the moment. Although it was disappointing to see you in that Expo commercial trying to gloss over the $311 million deficit because it's all going to come from lotteries, which you and I, Bill, know are in effect a tax on the poor. Now, here's Steve with the agenda for tonight.
The largest synagogue in Istanbul, Turkey. On Saturday, it is the scene of a terrorist bloodbath. 21 worshippers are murdered. Karachi Airport, Friday. Terrorists take over a Pan Am jetliner. When the smoke clears, 16 passengers are dead. South Africa. Mass funerals and rioting continue as the government defends its apartheid policies. And what of the United Nations as it celebrates its special day at Expo 86? Tonight, James Jonah, the Assistant Secretary General, talks about keeping the peace. Schizophrenia, how do the families cope? Elizabeth Plummer from Toronto's Clarke Institute tells us how. And are youth gangs terrorizing Vancouver's Chinatown? Chief Bob Stewart is in the studio with Webster to explain what the police know.
Well, Chief, for many years I was an old-fashioned police reporter, and I used to write some of these stories without the proper substantiation. You know, take a little thing and whip it up. Gang warfare. That will frighten many little old ladies in Vancouver or people from going into the area of the town known as Chinatown. Is this exaggerated or is it true?
Well, I think the headline is right on in terms of what the story is trying to tell us, Jack. It is gang warfare. It's warfare between rival gangs. The connotation that Chinatown is the hotbed is incorrect, however. Most of these events take place outside of Chinatown and could be anywhere in the city or the lower mainland, in fact. So I think the spokesman from the Chinese community, who's also quoted in the article, who says that the streets of Chinatown are safe, is quite correct.
Well, no matter what he says, if I'm kind of delicate about my personal safety and I read of 3 murders, I read of the difficulties of convicting because these gangs will not identify each other. Is it correct that they prefer their own retribution?
Oh, yes, definitely so. In fact, all of the murders that have been associated with this particular type of activity it's been a situation where the victim has been well known to the suspects who are responsible for the crime. So in that context, the honest, law-abiding citizen going about his daily duties is still very safe on our streets.
You're not really telling me that. I'm not
I want you to believe that.
But I'm going to be a little bit sardonic. Because I am not one of this particular group, I can walk with safety. The only trouble is I may be splattered with some shots fired from across the road trying to kill somebody else.
That's quite correct. There's been the odd case here where innocent bystanders were at risk, and of course that causes us a lot of concern as well. I guess it's really difficult when you see the recap of a year and a half of activity all portrayed in one article in the newspaper. I would suggest that if we printed the same article in regards to other types of crime that have occurred, sure, you just make it look really bad.
Now we come to the delicate area. We are also educated into not specifying any groups. But that story wouldn't make any sense, nor would I make any sense if I did not say directly to you, is this problem caused mainly by Vietnamese thugs, the small proportion who came to this country during the flight from Southeast Orient?
No, I think it goes further than that. I choose to call this an Asian gang problem rather than Chinese gangs, because what we're seeing is Hong Kong Chinese, we're seeing ethnic Chinese by way of Vietnam, we're seeing some from the People's Republic. People are moving reasonably freely now between China and Hong Kong in anticipation of takeover in some 10 or 11 years' time. So it's really quite a mix. We've even seen some people who claim Laos as their home. So we've seen Orientals that have moved around throughout Southeast Asia, now coming in by way of Hong Kong.
But it also is alleged that these people are as efficient and probably making as much money as the mafia, or what we call loosely the mafia, the underworld drug community, and for instance, including the bikers. Are they as big a menace as our normal, let's be racist, white drug traffickers?
No, I don't think they're as big a menace. I don't think they've cornered the market yet, but that's one of our concerns, is that with those kinds of Southeast Asia connections, they could well become the main pipeline for our drug problems.
Is it fair to say at all that these are ethnic Chinese gangs? I remember Harcourt, the mayor, got into trouble last year when he said that they were or 2 years ago, last year, public enemy number one were these thugs from whatever origin who are involved in these gang activities.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a question of trying to label a whole group of people, and I don't think that's our intention. There's no question that any ethnic group in our society has its share of thugs. In this particular case, we're seeing groups of young people, Asian background, joining together. In our case in Vancouver, we see a fight, a rivalry, if you wish, for territory, for authority, and it manifests itself in these kinds of events.
Next we come to the question of whether or not you can deal with it, because the great problem in dealing with these kind of closed segments of society is that you cannot penetrate to get the evidence to deal with them.
Well, let me tell you that in the last year and a half or so, we've probably made 50 apprehensions, and we've been to court on quite a few of them. We're not very successful in court, and the reason being is that we fail to get identification of suspects. You know, it's tough on a witness, particularly if there's a lot of pressure, some subculture, ethnic cultural pressure on them, to go, first of all, to the police station to pick someone out of a lineup, secondly, to appear at a preliminary hearing in a courtroom, and third, to go later, sometimes as long as 2 years later, to go to a trial at the Superior Court and to point their finger at someone and say, that's him.
Why is it difficult to point the finger? And the Chief Stewart will tell us this, I think, after the break. There is gang warfare in downtown Vancouver, and Chief Constable Robert Stewart of Vancouver was telling us of the difficulties of getting convictions. Why is it difficult to get people within the community to identify suspects or accused?
Well, people like the people that make up these gangs intimidate the people that they are involved with. There seems to be the unwritten code of violence begets violence, and they choose to look after things for themselves. We find it particularly difficult to get people to identify. Many of the cases on file, we're quite satisfied we know who the suspect is, and we should get a conviction. We're not getting it because of a thing called intimidation. And as you know, Jack, intimidation is an offense. You can't intimidate witnesses once there is a case before the court. So if we get to the court process and then intimidation takes place, We have to know about that and so that we can effectively investigate that and prosecute those people for that as well. And the system just breaks down for us. We just can't be effective.
They will not identify because they've been intimidated and, in fact, are in fear of their lives.
That's correct.
Well, mind you, we've had that in white drug cases too, but you were always able to the RCMP were able to say, okay, you're going to be a Crown witness, we're going to give you a new start in life, we're going to give you super protection and a new passport and put you away for the big drug traffickers, right?
That's right. There's lots of evidence to show that if you are a witness and that you are intimidated and you come to the police, the chance, there's a very good chance, in fact 99.9%, nothing will occur to you. The case will be successful and the suspect will be properly penalized. Now, you know, it's hard for us to get that across to people in some of the ethnic communities.
Well, they don't have the same kind of trust that even a white drug trafficker might have in police protection.
Quite correct. That's a major problem for us in dealing with people in ethnic communities, is to get them to understand that the police are here to protect them. If you don't tell us about the fact that somebody's trying to extort money from you, or that later you're being intimidated for going to the police, then how can the police be expected to deal with the problem?
To pick a phrase out of that story, are you alarmed by the growth of this in Vancouver?
I think what we're seeing right now is a peak of activity. We've seen some pretty quiet times in the last couple of years as well. It's one of these things that tends to peak and then disappear. I think it's connected with a particular individual or group of individuals who attempt to take over and show authority.
Yeah, but what's the structure? I think the report is that there are 30 or 40 in each of what, half a dozen gangs?
I would say we've got 4 identifiable groups.
4 major gangs.
Of about 40 apiece, and then of course there are associates. So there are many more numbers who are people who would like to align themselves with these groups.
And the younger ones, I presume, are guided into drugs and prostitution by the older ones.
Well, that's the usual format in any gang, is that the people at the top tend to recruit the workers who want to become lieutenants, and everyone starts to perform the usual procedures of gang warfare.
Now, this may or may not apply, but I know it applies generally, that if you've got a juvenile carrying drugs for you, that juvenile is virtually untouchable even when caught.
Well,
right?
Well, we know that we have a different system for juveniles in this country, and we also have a different system for those under the age of 12. And you know, we have reported cases of these people using people under the age of 12 to transport.
So that no charge whatsoever can be laid unless you can identify it with some adult or some properly aged juvenile, right?
That's
now, we've had how many immigrants of this type into this area recently? Do you know?
I think you have to. I think you'd have to check with somebody else, Jack. I'm not sure of the actual numbers.
A small proportion of these people who come in.
Well, there's so many different ways that they can come in. The visitors' permits, you know,
And
landed immigrants, you know, people who have completed all the paperwork for immigration come in as permanent residents. There's so many ways that it can happen.
And what would happen if one was ordered deported by, say, a judge, as happened in Toronto recently?
Then there would be a long series of appeals. We'd probably see that person sitting around or walking around on the street for the next couple of years.
Well, what special methods do you plan to take to try and curb this? Merely on-street activity? For instance, some of the weapons you've recovered, apart from guns, have been fearsome.
Yeah, they're threatening, really.
Is it something about aluminum pike poles sharpened at the ends?
Well, I think it runs the whole gamut. We've seen handguns, we've seen all kinds of knives, from small knives to large melon knives. We've seen explosives. I don't think there's any limit to the tools or weapons that can be used.
But your biggest difficulty, I mean, it's easy enough to infiltrate with an undercover people some of the kind of majority-type criminal activities, but you can't do it with these people, can you?
I think there's some saving graces here for us in the city. I think we have an excellent handle on the problem. We know the problem. It is not as though we were operating in the dark on this. And part of the reason that we are going public with these kinds of things is to raise a level in the community, an awareness level, hopefully not to make people paranoid about walking the streets, but we wanted to raise the level. We want, particularly in the ethnic community, to tell them of our problems. We can in fact deal with this problem if people report crime to us, if people will testify, And if necessary, we will protect those witnesses. We have to get successful prosecutions and put these kinds of people away for a long time.
In other words, extortion, for instance. You'll find in some of these communities that the people have no great trust in the police for reasons of their own, and they are reluctant to report extortion and will generally pay the extortion without complaining outside their own community.
Well, I think what happens, Jack, is if somebody tries to extort, that some people are prepared to pay until it becomes unbearable. But I think a lot of that, what I would call penny ante extortion, it's not penny ante to the individual, obviously, but the small stuff goes on quite a bit, not just with ethnic groups, with a lot of people. And people won't, just won't report. Well, don't expect the police or the criminal justice system to do anything until we get that kind of reporting and cooperation with the community. And I say that at this time, not just to people in these ethnic communities, people in the general community.
Right, but just to sum up, in this particular area, you've got 4 gangs of about 160 people, plus associates on the outside. They are tough, brutal, ruthless, and there are 3 murders unsolved and some shootings unsolved, correct?
Well, they're unsolved in that charges have not been laid or proceeded with. I won't tell you that I don't know who did that.
But that's no good to me, Chief.
I know it's no good
No
to
good
you.
telling me you know who did it if you can't nail them.
No, but I think I want you and I want the public to understand that the police do have a handle on this to the extent of that which they know.
And are you getting full cooperation from the other allied communities? Not yet.
Well, throughout the Lower Mainland, we have a good relationship. We've been using a joint force approach, as you know.
I know. Tough though, isn't it?
Well, it's a toughie, there's no
Have
question.
you any policemen who speak the dialects yet?
Yes.
Some. Well, I won't ask any more about that. Grateful to you, have sympathy with you. Don't be afraid to walk down any part of the city. And this particular group are liable to be seeking retribution and fighting their own little wars within themselves.
I think even the newspaper articles made it pretty clear that the victims were basically their own kind.
My thanks to Chief Stewart. Next we're going to talk to James Jonah, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, after the break. For 24 years, James O.C. Jonah has been with the United Nations. What is your precise title now as an Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Jonah?
Well, it's rather long. It's called Field Operation and External Support Activities, mainly to deal with peacekeeping operations.
So therefore, we in the United Nations have how many peacekeeping forces on the go at the moment?
At the moment, we have one in southern Lebanon, UNIFIL. We have one in the Golan Heights, UNDOF. We have one in Cypress, UNFICEP. And we have a group of observers, the oldest, in fact, in the whole Middle East, in Jerusalem, called UNSO. And we have one which is in India, Pakistan, which has been there for a long time, called UNMOGIB.
It's still on the India-Pakistan border.
Still there, still there.
And the Canadians are still in Cyprus.
They are still in Cyprus, doing a good job.
Should I ask if there are Canadians elsewhere? I should know, but I don't think there are.
Well, no, the only place we have them now is in Cyprus.
In Cyprus.
Yeah.
Now,
and also in UNDOF.
UNDOF is which
That's
one?
in Golan Heights. Yeah.
In the Golan Heights.
Yes, yeah.
You can expect lots of trouble in Israel now, too, and in the Lebanon, after the massacre in the temple, the synagogue in Istanbul. Am I correct?
Yes. Well, in fact, the UN force in Lebanon has been experiencing very difficult times. Just last week, the French lost 3 of their soldiers who were jogging along, and the UN is exposed to terrorism as any individual or national.
Well, of course, the ones who suffered the most were the Americans, but they were not there as a peacekeeping force, or were they?
They were as a peacekeeping force, but not under the UN. They were there in part of a multinational force together with the British, with the French, and the Italians. And of course, that was a regrettable development. But we do not see this as our type of peacekeeping, because we try not to use heavy weapons, whereas the US and the French and the British, they had very heavy weapons, including in New Jersey.
They, and the Americans, of course, the
Yes,
New Jersey.
yes.
But the fact is that the peacekeeping is really just a token thing to remind people there is a potential for settlement. They can't really do anything, can they?
Well, actually, the whole idea of peacekeeping is to contain a crisis and to allow the nations to resolve the issue. But we saw what happened in 1967. Of course, the Canadians were involved. When we withdrew a peacekeeping force in the Sinai, we had the 6-Day War. So I think we should not belittle the role played by peacekeeping forces. They do contain the crisis, and if we have some luck, we can try to resolve it.
But I never see anything happening in Beirut except more car bombs, more bus bombs, more killings, and killings of the United Nations forces in the blue helmets.
Yeah.
Really, it's hardly, I suppose it would be bad still to remove these forces.
Exactly, this is the dilemma. I mean, we have had UNIFIL now since 1978. Everyone realizes it doesn't really solve the problem, but what will happen if you take it out? You create a vacuum, you create more killings, more tragedies.
Does the United Nations look at the international terrorism? These two examples last week, first of all in Karachi, which was abominable, followed by Istanbul. The United Nations is really powerless to police, to prevent events like that.
Well, the UN is as powerless as any sovereign government. But one thing we must bear in mind, the UN has already adopted certain conventions regarding hijacking, regarding kidnapping, and also the question of taking of hostages. And I also must say that the UN Security Council and the General Assembly last year unanimously adopted a resolution against international terrorism. And it is my own view that these resolutions and these attitude of the governments have created a new norm against terrorism. Today, it is very difficult to find governments supporting openly terrorism compared to, say, 5-6 years ago when these terrorists were welcomed in countries. Today, governments don't do it because the UN has sent a norm which governments know is against terrorism.
So there are two weapons that must be used. First of all, the United Nations resolution that countries will not give sanctuary to terrorists.
Exactly, yeah.
And the other thing is that where terrorists can be contained, you should never give in to them by giving them fuel and pilots to go away.
Yeah.
One must put the hostages at total risk. Is that not correct?
Well, this is the preferred approach, but one has to have real good training as to how you deal with terrorists, because in fact in the Karachi situation you see there's already dispute among governments as to whether or not the Pakistanis did the right thing. You always have this debate. But I think for the UN, the approach is to oppose terrorism on the one hand, and on the other to try to resolve some of these underlying disputes which produce the reasons for terrorism.
Yeah, but you can't expect all nations to have the Delta forces or the SAS or the West German forces to that level of training, who are the only people who, or the Israelis, for instance. They're the experts, or they're not, still from Entebbe.
Yeah.
But these are, I suppose we must just live with terrorism.
Well,
and stay away from places where they hijack aircraft.
Well, somebody said that we have been able to tolerate, in a sense, because even today you go to the airports, you tolerate certain inconveniences because we want to prevent terrorism. But you can see from what happened over the weekend, what can you do? You're going to have prayers and then somebody comes in and shoots in. What defense do you have?
It's quite intolerable, isn't it?
Completely intolerable.
Then we come to the big battle today. Maggie Thatcher, Botha, Tutu, the Americans intransigence, and the British intransigence on sanctions against Africa. I suppose we must just sit and wait for Africa to explode. But the United Nations is, of course, powerless in that situation.
Well, I don't think you can say the UN is powerless, because the United Nations over the years has adopted principles which make it now possible for everyone to condemn apartheid. You know, during the interwar years, when in Germany they were developing this Nazi policy, there was no one to set standards. And what was the result? When we discovered that in Germany, a highly developed country, 6 million people were killed, people said, how was it possible for the world community to sit back and allow this to continue? Now the UN is saying, we will never permit it. We will make our voices heard that apartheid is illegal, it's against human dignity, and therefore in 50 years, people will say the UN at least speak out. We may not be able to coerce South Africa. We may not be able to force governments to impose sanctions, but at least we have made it very clear that apartheid is illegal and cannot be tolerated.
You're telling me 10 years down the road, if out of the, I think it's 40 million blacks in South Africa, isn't it?
About 28 million.
28 million against 5 million whites.
Yes.
That if 10 million people die in South Africa over a long period of bloodshed, we'll be able to say, at least the United Nations warned about it. But that's all you can do, is warn about it.
Well, no, I think we have made a lot of progress. Let us be very fair now, because I could never have believed 5 years ago that we will see in the US Congress such a swell of opposition against apartheid.
I mean, that reactionary, me speaking, that reactionary body, the US Congress, it's surprising, I must confess, to see that there's any swell at all against apartheid or in favor of sanctions.
No, well, I think the Congress really has adopted measures which is judged to be at least a movement forward. Mm-hmm. It is true that the president is against what Congress has adopted, but it is a good sign when you find even conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats agreeing that something must be done against both a regime.
Everybody's out of step, but Maggie Thatcher. Why do you think she is so intransigent about applying full sanctions against South Africa?
Well, I believe that if you follow the British government, they have generally been against sanctions, whether it's against Libya or against South Africa, but of course, like many governments, when it came to Argentina in the Falkland War, the Malvinas War, they were for sanctions. Now, what caused some disquiet amongst many Africans was that in the Commonwealth, they believed they had an agreement with the British that if the eminent group should go to South Africa and find the government not willing to cooperate, that then Britain would follow suit. And they were very much surprised that even though you have this eminent group, men these are government officials of Australia and others, who came back and said, we believe the government of South Africa is not serious to negotiate. And they felt at that time she should have moved. But of course, it is known that the economic consequences of Britain is very severe.
Simply put, 280,000 jobs would be lost.
This is exactly the problem.
You can't hardly blame them, can you?
Well, at least we should begin to look at moral principles. I know this may say starry-eyed liberalism, but frankly speaking, we should begin to think about the human consequences of this thing, because you cannot always put the economic factor ahead of principles.
And this is James Jonah, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, for which we all pay a little dollar here and there, don't we?
Definitely.
And I'm going to take phone calls to Mr. Jonah on South Africa or whatever immediately after good, clear, sharp, succinct phone calls on your opinion and your comment after the break. Don't sing. Not allowed to sing that. Are you kind of Christian?
Yes, I am. And a priest too.
Which denomination? I come with the Bible in one hand.
Yeah,
Trade
I'm pulling
goods
my
with the other. Like your boy Jim Carney has been running a good pavilion down at Expo.
Yes, very good. I like it very much.
Quite pleased with it.
Very much so.
South Africa really is insoluble. And can I make my prediction to you on South Africa?
Please. Yeah.
When the trouble breaks out on a big scale, guess who'll step in to help the South African establishment? The Americans. Right?
Well, I hope not.
But they're kind of paranoid about an all-black South Africa in which they'd lose some influence and control.
Well, I believe that there is still room for constructive solution in South Africa. There's still room. It's not yet
not yet too late.
No.
Despite the ANC.
It does, no, I don't think so. You see what Tutu said yesterday in his enthronement, you know, he still said, look, if Botha is prepared, even at this late stage, to make changes, he is prepared to call off this idea of sanctions.
You mean a 5-year disappearance of apartheid might do the trick?
Well, it all depends what Botha is prepared to do, you know.
Okay, go ahead to Mr. Jonah of the UN.
Thank you. Mr. Jonah, why does the UN collectively wish to implement sanctions in South Africa when sanctions have never worked anywhere for anything? And all that's going to end up happening, if this government is overthrown, is we're going to have another Rhodesia with one party, one political party. And if they don't call themselves communists, they are communists. That's what one political party is. It's communism.
Well, let me say that, that sanctions have never worked in the past is no excuse to try. It is true, historically.
But it's a waste of time.
Yeah, but wait a minute. Why don't you say the same thing to the United States in Cuba? Why don't you say the same thing when it comes to the question of Afghanistan? These were all sanctions. Now,
Maybe I did say the same thing.
No, okay, well, all right. I am saying is we have no alternative. This is a peaceful means. We cannot use force. We don't want to use force. Therefore, we recommend that.
Mr. Jonah,
Yeah.
change takes time. It didn't happen overnight in the United States. It's not going to happen overnight in South Africa. I don't care what you say, the UN says, or Tutu says. The change cannot take place overnight. It's going to take time. You know as well as I do that Botha is the most liberal leader that South Africa has ever had, and the only alternative to Botha is a neoconservative government that would be more right-wing than the Ku Klux Klan in the United States.
Good point.
Well, let me say something. You know, this is a very strange thing for me to hear, that Botha is one of the most liberal South Africans. Please do not...
most liberal South African who's been in power.
In power.
That's
Well,
right.
Well, I would doubt that. I would doubt
Well,
that.
Smuts was long ago removed. He was a different kettle.
Well, no. Smuts, in fact, you see, the Smuts belonged to the English wing of the South African, and he really did not believe in the apartheid system.
Right.
So don't say that. I think Botha, and we must not forget that these people who run the government in South Africa were in sympathy with Germany during the Second World War.
Don't have to tell
we
me.
tend to forget it.
No, I know that.
You know, so when people talk about Botha being liberal, look at his past, you know, and it's also easy to say...
Liberal compared to what the alternative is.
Well, wait a minute. You may say to yourself, it takes time when you are not under apartheid. If you were the ones under apartheid day in, day out and suffering, you will never say that.
Of course, but just let me throw in one other little irritant. It took the Americans 100 years to implement the wiping out of slavery, didn't it?
Yes, it takes time, and, you know, there were many, I think, liberal people all over in England, in
Who fought for
Parliament, who fought for it. It takes time, but I feel that there's nothing wrong in the international community saying we cannot tolerate apartheid.
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Jonah?
Yep.
About the hijackings, is there not something the airlines or the airplanes can have, like tear gas that would go off from a ground control, or a sonic sound that would be ear-piercing to
He's asking
drive
about...
people out of the planes before they, before the terrorists had a chance to just attack them?
Well, look, you are dealing with really irresponsible people who really have no respect for human lives. That's the first thing you are dealing with. Now, whatever you do, you are going to have counter-reaction. Now, what happened with the Pan Am? They agreed on a system whereby the pilots will disappear. Now, people are saying, why should they disappear? They should be in charge of the people on the plane. So it is more or less to try to find an agreement among governments to prevent international terrorism.
As much as you can, because
Yes.
you cannot wipe out crazy people with a hand grenade in their pocket.
Exactly, yeah.
And technical advances are something else again, which... Go ahead, please.
Oh, Jack?
Yep.
Oh, I spent a couple of months in South Africa, and the sanctions, I feel that basically that's just going to affect the blacks more and more. And I wonder what the feeling would have been if they put more strength against the governments, England especially, to really bring up the management in their companies in South Africa with black people. In other words, do what the Afrikaans...
Well, let me put it to Mr. Jonah. Is it too late for that kind of civilized move now?
Well, you see, let's put it this way. You have what is called the Sullivan Principles. The Sullivan Principles apply to a minority of businessmen, in fact, American businessmen who are not in the majority. Now, if you should have a situation where you say to all of these business people, now you have to devise a policy which does not discriminate. And I can tell you they will not last in South Africa at all. They will not last. And you have a curious situation where the businessmen today in South Africa are pushing for reforms. But unfortunately, these businessmen are mostly the Anglo-South Africans.
The Anglo-Africans are the goodies.
Who don't have any influence in the Afrikaner party.
The diamond man, De Beers, he has tried for years to be a little bit more tolerant
but
and understanding.
His influence in policy making is very, 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 very
Go ahead, please.
Is that me?
That's you, sir.
Thank you. Earlier, Mr. Jonah, you mentioned 2 resolutions that was passed in the United Nations concerning terrorism.
Yeah.
I would like to know when one of these nations failed to lead up to the resolutions and that they've signed it. And I'd like to hear your answer. I'm going to hang up. Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, you know, the resolutions which have been adopted are declaratory in nature. They create a norm. Now, what is important is that once you have that kind of a resolution, it is difficult for governments today to say, well, we applaud what happened in Karachi, we applaud what happened in Turkey. In the past, you had governments actually decorating terrorists. I can tell you it is going to be very difficult today for governments to decorate terrorists because they know they're not going to be tolerated in the United Nations. Now, if you want to have sanctions, it's difficult. Now, for God's sake, look at what has happened with the United States, with Libya. What more could they do? They never stopped the Libyans.
They scared me half to death.
You know, so if the UN hasn't got all of the military power that the US has, what could it do that the US cannot do?
Go ahead, please.
Jack.
Yeah.
Mr. Jonas. Yeah, I have 3 quick points. First, your caller previously that was talking about it takes time. You came close to saying it, but let's face it, it took war to end slavery in the United States, right?
It took war to end Hitler.
It took war to end Hitler. This is true, and this is what we're talking about here. Secondly, Mr. Jonas, before the last break, came very close to talking or summing up the British position was economics over morality, right? Let's face it, England has a very big economic stake in that country, and that's why they're making the decision. I think if it was strictly a moral decision, they have a good moral background in international affairs, and if it was strictly a moral decision, they no doubt would make the right decision, but it isn't for them. Economics comes before morals. And I'd like to leave you with one comment for discussion. Israel has been cooperating with South Africa in some ways. What are your views on that, Mr. Jonas and Mr. Webster, for that matter?
Well, frankly speaking, this has been a dilemma for the Israelis. I mean, those of us who have been working on the Middle East problem have made it clear to the Israelis that they could not succeed in black Africa if they continue to have this kind of involved relations with South Africa. Now, the Israelis say this is unfair to them because they say, why are you singling us out? Well, I think for the Africans, you know, the Israelis stand apart. They come from a people who have suffered the evils of racism, and therefore they expect from them higher standards. Of course, the Israelis too were frustrated when many Africans broke relations with them in '73, but the Israelis say, well, if we move against South Africa, we have lots of Jews who are living in South Africa, they might suffer the brunt of it. But my own feeling is that increasingly the Israelis are realizing that unless they change their stand with South Africa, they are not going to have this widespread relationship with Africa.
Except, of course, you must agree that the Israelis are in a survival mode. And Israel, under Peres or under Sharon, will always do what is necessary to attempt to survive, even if it means trading with South Africa.
Well, you know, I'm not so sure. You know, I was very much impressed as an observer of Israel at the way the Israeli people reacted during the time of the Shatila massacre.
Yes.
It was really phenomenal that the people of Israel against their own government. So I think that in Israel, you do have sense of value among the people. And I believe that...
You're talking about the public demonstrations against the action taken by the Israeli military forces.
So you do have in Israel that kind of a moral suasion which can make a difference.
Well, our time is just about up. Mr. Jonah, you have been a wellspring of information and attitudes. And I wish you well in your endeavors in the future, and I hope it doesn't come to bloody war. That's not swearing. Bloody war in South Africa.
Well, I thank you, Jack, for giving us this opportunity, because I think quite often the UN is misunderstood, and I think it is our obligation to try to explain at least to the people why the UN...
We don't get enough spokesmen like you to appear in public television in Western Canada.
Thank you very much.
My thanks to Mr. Jonah. Next, I'm going to turn to a problem involved with serious matter of schizophrenia, and Elizabeth Bentley from University of Toronto after the break.
Thank you.
When guests are offered to me on the topic of mental illness, one tends to back off. You don't want to depress people. But the fact is that one of the heartbreaking factors in life today, and God knows I've had dozens of calls about it, are from the relatives of schizophrenics. In fact, it's so sad to get a phone call which says, "Dear Mr. Webster, can you help us? We're afraid of our son." And I'll say to them, "How old is your son?" And they'll say, "Mid-40s." And I'll say, "What's the problem?" And they'll say, "Schizophrenia." Nobody seems to help. Elizabeth Plummer is a lecturer at the University of Toronto and a nurse, Department of Psychiatry and whatnot, and she's working on a plan to help the BC Friends of Schizophrenics improve the treatment of schizophrenics. But first I'll need some basic facts. How many schizophrenics in Canada?
Mr. Webster, there are at least 1% of the population who are diagnosed schizophrenia.
Now, schizophrenia, the symptoms of schizophrenia are sometimes rather frightening, or they're not.
Some of the symptoms seem to be frightening. However, there are symptoms that are not frightening. And some of the frightening symptoms that you probably have read about are hallucination, like people hear things and see things. Their minds play tricks on them. And some of the not so frightening symptoms are people who are withdrawn, quiet, seem to be in a shell.
And the other frightening symptom, which one must face up to, is sometimes inexplicable violence.
That is a myth, I would say. It is a myth. There are more violent people in the general population than observed in people who suffer from schizophrenia.
Now, I'll agree with you on that in the general population we have many violent people for other reasons. But the people who phone me often are afraid. And sometimes you find it very difficult to get them the proper treatment. So perhaps we should split down that 1% into the categories.
A lot has been written about the categories of schizophrenia, and in fact, let me clarify that this big word schizophrenia is like a grab bag word. We're talking about a whole lot of illnesses, various types, various categories, various stages, depending on the age of onset, depending on who it affects and their reaction to the illness.
Some of the patients respond very well to the modern drugs.
Some respond very well, and we're talking about a 1/3 of that 1% who
do not respond.
And those are the people we are concerned about and families are concerned about.
And sometimes, if these people are not institutionalized, the families just can't cope and the people tend to wander and live a very depressing private life.
Mr. Webster, it is heart-rending for the families of those people who do not respond to medication or to psychiatric treatment. They are in despair. They suffer a lot of hardship. And this is one of the reasons why I am in Vancouver, to promote education of the families and friends of schizophrenia.
You see, already I need education too, so many other people must need it as well. You have a program of a relatives and friends program, living and working with schizophrenia. Has it been demonstrated as being useful for families?
It has been demonstrated over and over since we started 10 years ago to educate and support families. This program has become international. And when I say international, it has drawn people from all over the world. For instance, A lady came to see me from Johannesburg, South Africa, 3 years ago. She was desperate. Her daughter was locked up in the psychiatric institution in Johannesburg. She went to England, she went to US, she came to me in Canada. We talked, I gave her a hug. We gave her lots of information. She was back just last month, a much different lady.
Is there a simple secret in how families can live with a schizophrenic member who does not respond to the drug treatments?
You know, I wish there was. I would spread it all over British Columbia, but there isn't. It's a very difficult, complicated, heart-rending illness to live with, to treat. Can you imagine what it is like for the person who suffered from schizophrenia?
I know what it's like, and one of the dangers, as demonstrated in the United States and occasionally here, that the schizophrenic for whom there is no treatment or no family is left as an outcast wandering, correct?
And that is pathetic, because
Terrible.
that is not socially responsible of our society, is it?
No, no, no.
I think we need to be more humane, to recognize people, to help them, to recognize the family. And this brings me to the British Vancouver families and friends.
Right.
They are struggling to set up an organization that will educate the public, that will help families to cope better, and most of all, that will help to people who suffer from schizophrenia.
Where are you having this meeting on? Does it say on the label where we're having the meeting? It does.
On Thursday, there is going to be a public forum which is to educate people, to share information at the...
BC Tel Auditorium,
That's right.
3777
That's
Kingsway,
right.
near Boundary Road.
That's right.
So, first of all, you slapped my wrist for suggesting that some schizophrenics might be on occasion violent. Was that bad of me to say that?
I think it's misconception that they are violent. People with schizophrenia respond when they are threatened, when they're afraid, when the voices tell them to.
There is no
They're
cure.
not generally violent.
There is no cure as such for schizophrenia.
There is no cure, and that's what makes it so hard and so difficult and so heart-rending. However, there is what is called a social recovery, and this is what we want to teach families about, that they're never to give up, they're to hope, they are to keep on trying, they're not to get burnout, because someday there will be a cure. Do you believe that?
Well, I've always believed that most mental illnesses are caused by chemical imbalance in the body and not by anything else. Am I wrong again?
No, there is evidence that there is chemical imbalance in the body, that schizophrenia is a legitimate disease.
Right.
It is a medical disease, just like heart disease, diabetes, epilepsy.
That's the point I was making. And as such, we're making progress, but a cure has not yet been found.
A cure has not been found. We know only about 10% of the information to date.
Elizabeth Plummer, I'm delighted you came. I wish you well with your public lecture, 7:30, Thursday night at the BC Tel Auditorium, 3777 Kingsway, near Boundary. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much.
I'm associated with the BC Friends of Schizophrenia.
And please,
I'm a
for
supporter.
the general public, please call 734-3613 if you want to be a volunteer for the BC Friends and Schizophrenia.
Thank you, Elizabeth Plummer.